right, everyone, welcome to episode 3 of the Podluck podcast. Thank you for joining us again. If you're joining us for the first time, the Podluck podcast welcomes you. We are a conversation podcast about the intersection of culture and faith for Korean American Adventists. And so, like I mentioned, it's our 3rd episode. It's still relatively new in our process of kind of developing a podcast. My name is Jason Kim, and I am joined by our co-host, Chris Chong.
Hi, everyone. So glad that you're with us. We're still trying to figure things out, and we're so thankful that you're going along with us on the journey.
Yes, to our early adopters, thank you. And again, feedback is much appreciated as we still find our footing in this new venture. So the last episode we kind of talked about the state of the church. We talked about the different churches that exist, how many pastors, English ministry pastors there are, how many churches could feasibly support an English ministry pastor. And we wanted to kind of give like a very brief general overview on the status of our church. And so today we wanted to kind of look backwards and kind of see how we started as a Korean American Adventist group. And then I guess maybe more importantly, where we are now relative or compared to then. And then I guess the most important of all, where it's going. And so that's kind of on the topic list for today. And so the history of the Korean church, Chris, I don't know, are you aware or versed on the history and the formation of the Korean American Adventist Church in the United States?
A little bit. I had the privilege of being a member of the very first Korean American Seventh-day Adventist Church in Los Angeles. So growing up there, I think we'll talk about kind of what it was like and, what it meant to be a part of the very first church. And so, I'm that's been my primary experience. Beyond that, just kind of a general understanding.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so, I mean, the rise of the Korean American Church in America, Korean American Adventist Church, I should say, it correlates with the different waves of Korean immigrants, right? So we had essentially 3 major waves of immigration from Korea to America. And so the creation was kind of in between the 2nd and 3rd waves. We're talking about, 70s kind of going into the early mid 80s. I believe LA Central celebrated their, is it 60th anniversary not too long ago?
Yeah, when I pastored there, starting in 2012, there was the big 50th anniversary celebration. So, probably 60 a couple of years ago.
60, right? And so that we call LA Central, I don't know if it's endearing or what it is, but we call it the mother church. It was the first Korean Adventist church, and then it spawned multiple churches, not directly, obviously. It's not like LA went out to different states to plant, but based on the model shown, other Korean communities throughout the country kind of started creating Korean churches. The Korean American Church specifically started also in LA Central when they hired, I guess he's known as Pastor Richard Che. Chris and I know him only as Dr. Richard Che from our time in the seminary. He's a professor there. But he was the first youth pastor hired by LA for the sole purpose of pastoring the English-speaking youth or young people. Were you part of that group?
No, he started in 1983 or something. I feel like, is that wrong? That seems a little too early.
No, I mean, it's definitely mid 80s. I just assumed you were 16 then.
Listen. I was born in 1983. So no, I was not a part of that. I remember, so, and I think we're going to talk about this, but, LA Central was very much had a pioneering spirit. I think the fact that it was the first church. And so they started doing a lot of things that were really actually doing things with a lot of forethought and thinking about the future. And I remember they were one of the first churches to put all the former pastor pictures on the wall. somewhere.
Yes.
And so he was the first one. And I feel like I
Uh-huh.
remember seeing the date 83 or 84. So no, I was
Okay.
born
That makes sense.
like around when he came.
Okay.
But I had church members who were the initial like
Mhm.
youth group, initial like guinea pigs for this like English ministry thing that they're trying to start.
Yeah, and I remember this past West Coast camp meeting, Dr. Che was one of the morning speaker for the English adults, and he would kind of make these kind of references to that time, like when he first started as a youth pastor, and the same church members that I would be the pastor of when I was in LA, they would kind of talk about those early days. It's kind of like this, like, I use the word unregulated in the sense of like it was just, okay, young pastor, here are our kids, go.
Yeah.
And that was it. And a lot of the stories are just very like, yeah, we don't know how we survived that, but we did. And it's kind of like, to Chris's point, it was a very brand new thing. And so LA just kind of started it, and then from my understanding, the next two English groups that started were in Loma Linda. I think it was Pastor Wonil Kim, and then Spencerville in Maryland with Pastor Sung And so I think those three churches were kind of the first churches to kind of have an English group. Back then, the phrase English ministry was not a thing. Everyone was youth.
Yeah. It was just youth pastor.
Right. 청년 목사, youth pastor.
Yeah.
And then, yeah, I think that kind of started. And, from as a pastor, we refer to those three pastors as the big three. They were the ones that kind of started English ministry and create the template. And then from there came like the first real, like I say, career opportunity or career path for Korean American pastors to be pastors of a almost exclusively Korean American English speaking ministry, I think.
Yeah.
Right. And so we start with like Pastor Peter On, and then he had his group, Pastor Jonathan Park, Pastor Robin Park, Pastor Chin Kim, and then they kind of created their thing. Chris and I, we both love football. In football, there's a thing called coaching trees, where there's like a coach and he has all these assistants, and these assistants will then be hired as coaches at different teams, and they all kind of follow the same system. And so we kind of jokingly call, the pastor tree. And so, but that's really what it is, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So you were like under the Pastor Peter On pastoral tree.
Yeah. So he was my pastor at LA Central when I was, I think, early teens. He baptized me at 16, and my brother. And then he hired me for my first full-time youth pastoring job at Glendale when he was the Korean senior pastor there. And so I learned a lot from him and was kind of, under the Peter On tree.
Right. And I consider myself under the Jonathan Park pastoral tree, because he was my pastor when I was in Maryland. And then when I kind of was getting into ministry, he was there to kind of help me in that way. And then from there, it kind of spread, so that any Korean church that had kids, and essentially that's what it was, right? It was children of the parents that were on the Korean side. They would bring someone in to kind of do ministry for their kids in English every week. And then the expectation...
And we were in a situation, unlike a lot of other churches, where the children could not speak the language of the first generation parents. And so that was really the motivation behind this, because you have in other ethnic churches, what they would do is they would just make the kids learn the language, and then they sit with them in the service. So I know Spanish churches are generally like that, but for whatever reason, the Koreans, like I'm one of them. We just didn't learn very much Korean, and so they felt the need. We need to have a person to take care of the kids, and like. It was borderline babysitting, with like, you just do stuff. And I think I've heard stories about some of the things that they did at camping, and like, those things would not fly now. Like you would get in huge trouble. You would get sued. You would get fired. Like it's actually kind of crazy. I mean, So I don't want to tell any stories to get anybody in trouble, but it was insane kind of what youth ministry was like
Mhm.
at that time.
Right. So, Chris, for a while it was called youth pastor, youth ministry, and then somewhere in the history it kind of transitioned into English ministry, English speaking pastor. So, when do you think that transition took place?
So I think I can only speak from what I remember and my
Hmm.
experience. And again, it was through the LA Central experience,
Hmm.
because the people that Dr. Richard Che, ministered to eventually grew up
Hmm.
and became working professionals and entering to the workforce in different capacities. And I remember at some point, like in the I want to say late 90s, early 2000s, at LA Central, there was a general shift that the ministry of this English speaking pastor needed to go beyond youth and high schoolers and had to do ministry towards 30-year-olds and late 20-year-olds and getting to people who are getting closer to their 40s. And so they're formed, I wish I had the actual date, but they're formed Living Water Fellowship at LA
Hmm.
Central, and that was kind of the first that I can remember a identity that was being created outside of the mother church. So
Hmm.
it wasn't LA Central Korean English Ministry. They set up their own name, and there's a lot of challenges in discussing like the governance and
Hmm.
operations in this model, which is now called the church within the church model.
Hmm.
But I think when churches started doing that kind of stuff, making this church within a church, separate boards, separate finances, that's really kind of the launch of like the English
Hmm.
ministry title, rather than like youth group of the Korean church.
Right. And I think that model, again, as much as a church could, they wanted to adopt. I think that was a sign of like a healthy church in that time was, are you able to support an English ministry church, not just a youth group? And it's really crazy when you think about it because this doesn't exist in other churches where there's like the lead pastor and there's the EM pastor who is technically officially an associate pastor to the lead pastor, but then the EM pastor could also then hire a youth pastor specifically, right? So, uh, you know, um, most of the EM churches that we know, especially in the West Coast, they would have like a EM pastor and then an EM youth pastor, uh, which is again unheard of in other churches. It's like associate to the associate pastor kind of a thing. But before we kind of get into kind of like the different church models and like kind of the ramifications and downstream effects today, you know, we're kind of fortunate to have two people who were part of kind of the early English ministry churches in the country. So we wanted to kind of share just like brief memories and just experiences we had at our church. So Chris, like, what was it like growing up in LA Central, like the mother church?
I think the thing that stands out the most was the sense of pride
Mm-hmm.
in all the members. There
Mm-hmm.
was this spirit of we are LA Central, and no matter what happened, we are LA Central. We are like the forefathers of
Mm-hmm.
all the churches, and so there's a level of self-esteem that is very healthy in that they had a lot of pride in what they had accomplished and what God did in their ministry in the past. But as you would imagine, that also could lead to some issues, that sense of pride. But like what's interesting is not just in the Korean ministry, but in like the English ministry and the youth, there is a sense of like we are LA Central. And
Mm-hmm.
this is like a very special place, and this is very important. So I got to see that as a youth member, but
Mm-hmm.
also as the pastor years later,
Mm-hmm.
that kind of spirit. And I remember this one of the Korean elders, and Jason, you know who I'm talking about. If anyone who goes to LA Central or knows people there, we used to call him like the radio man. He was this elder with this super loud, booming voice, and he would always tell me that you're going to be a conference president, and like LA Central will have created a conference president, and he would talk about like his dream for that, just like that spirit of like, man, we're gonna do so much, and we're
Uh-huh.
so I saw that a lot. I saw that a
Sure.
lot. And again, like I said, there are some times it was great. and then sometimes it was not great.
Mm-hmm.
But there was a strong identity. Even like as a member, I was a youth growing up there, and then I went to college and I studied theology, and my first position was at Glendale. And at that time I was early 20s. And then I remember my peers from LA Central, like they would call me traitor.
Mm-hmm.
Like they would use the word traitor to describe me because I got a job. Like, you're not giving me a job, but I got a job at this other church, and they would give me flack, and they would call me traitor and whatnot. And so, like, I think that stems from that, like, oh, we're LA Central, and you can't leave here. This is a very special place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting how similar it is, in Maryland. I mean, we weren't the first church, but I don't even know if Spencerville was like the first Korean church in the East Coast. It probably wasn't. I would imagine like a New York church was one of the first. But I think, yeah, growing up, there definitely was that sense of pride of being from Spencerville. When I got my first job in Virginia, which is a little bit further from Spencerville than like Glendale is from LA. Yeah, I was also called
for context. Oh, really? For context, Glendale's like 15 minutes away.
Right. With traffic, it's probably closer to like 2 hours, but
So you were also called traitor, even though
Yeah.
you like worked 2 hours away.
yeah, I mean, I was technically in a different state. And same with you. I'm like, you're not giving me a job as I'm trying to get into ministry. This is like my internship, so to speak. But yeah, I was called traitor, and we didn't have as many interchurch sporting things in the East Coast just because we're so much more spread apart. But I remember one time we did have like a Maryland, Virginia area basketball night, and it was like, who are you gonna play for? It was like one of those things.
It's like, are you gonna play for USA or China?
Yeah, yeah, it was very
Those controversies that were. Alyssa Liu she competed for America.
Fortunately, Virginia was like all young kids, so they didn't have a team. But yeah,
you know what? I think that's really interesting that in Spencerville there was that LA Central, and I'm almost beginning to think that it was not even so much like, oh, we're the first church, but I feel like there was this pride in every little church community.
Sure.
I think. And the reason why I say that is, like, I know camp meeting is very different now, but when I was growing up going to camp meeting was like gangs. It was like really silly, like church gang vibe. And churches would beef with other churches and have like problems. And so like LA Central would beef with like Rosemead or something. And then like Napa would beef with like Valley, or I don't know. Like, I've heard these stories where these people would not get along, and they would like, these churches would not like these other churches.
Mm-hmm.
And I there was this kind of tribalism, maybe because it was early and like we weren't connected, but there was this great sense of like, this is who we are.
Oh yeah,
this is our church, and we're gonna like destroy other churches or something.
Yeah, same with the East. The difference with the East, though, is it was more geographically, like state lines, so there was like the Chicago churches, and they like temporarily put, they had like temporary gang truce and came together for camp meeting. They're like the Detroit churches, the Maryland churches. We were all kind of friendly rivalry, but still a rivalry. We spent more time with each other during joint retreats and things like that, but there was still like a sizing up that happened, and then Atlanta was like the crazy place. Crazy people.
I remember being scared of people at camp meeting,
right?
And I remember a particular guy, I don't remember his name, but he walked past me and he bumped his shoulder, like he hit me with his shoulder. It's like a very aggressive, macho, like, I will dominate you vibe. That was, and I think that like, that's kind of immigrant mentality, And so that found its way into the church as well. In some ways it created like a close-knit community, but also like generally unhealthy, in the
Sure.
larger church landscape.
So I don't know if this happened in the West, but in the East, like the manifestation, like the culmination of this like gang rivalry was always at the basketball tournament. Um,
Yeah.
it was. I mean, it was crazy. It would get crazy. I mean, they were like threatening to shut it down, and there were like fights, and like people took basketball tournament very seriously. In the
Yeah, it
East,
was like that. That was where always the most fights happened.
right?
And but then it's also always like the same people. And so
That is
all the
also
other churches
true.
be like, ooh, those like bad kids.
Uh-huh.
It was definitely the case.
Yeah, for
Uh,
sure. I mean, even when I was like kind of in ministry, like that, tribalistic feeling kind of went away when I got to college. But there was still a little bit, especially basketball tournament. Like, oh, like a New York church won this year, so like New York would have, their thing, and then like the Maryland churches would win one year, and we'd have our own thing. So it's even though like that crazy tribalism was gone, that pride still exists.
yeah, yeah. I definitely think that's true.
Yeah. Um. So what was LA like in terms of like the structure, like when you were going to church, in terms of like when you worship, where you worship, how it kind of how the EM and the KM had to like coexist, because it was a relatively small space back then, right?
Yeah. From well, when I was there was a large renovation project,
Mm-hmm.
and probably about a year or something. And so the English ministry, we worshipped at the hospital because we were right next to White Memorial Hospital. So we rented out an auditorium for like a year, and then we went back. And so they had basically built out a large building where the second floor was the English Ministry Fellowship Hall and Sanctuary and Worship Space. So we ran services concurrently
Mm-hmm.
in two separate locations. The downstairs classrooms were generally Sabbath schools for the EM. So it was mostly an EM building. In fact, there was a big sign that said Living Water Fellowship
Mm-hmm.
on that building. I'm curious. I was so young at the time. I'm really curious how the funding happened and how that worked
Mm-hmm.
out. But it was very much like this is for the English ministry. And then the Korean side did eventually renovate their space as well. But it was, I know that there was a lot of discussions regarding the separation of finances. If you're not involved in like church leadership, that is the rubber meets the road moment for a lot of churches, is when the English group or the second group has authority over their own funds.
Mm-hmm.
That conversation is the conversation where some churches have been able to launch into an English ministry, or
Mm-hmm.
that's where they were never able to launch into one because of that particular issue. Do we have our own bank account where we can sign our own checks, or do we still have to ask for money from our parents? So at LA Central, I'm sure through a lot of difficult meetings and difficult conversations, LA Central and Living Water Fellowship were able to split finances and operations and have a separate board. So we functioned rather independently, but I think at the early stages there was still a lot of like murkiness and things that were unclear. And you still, and this is still a problem, or I think it's a problem where the second generation or English ministries are still referred to as 청년. And so you'd have like 50-year-old 청년 at your church, like,
Mm-hmm.
these people are almost the same age, but it's just like that classification. And that's just how the Korean ministry understands us. And sometimes it's kind of like belittling, but sometimes that's just what they call us. But that's kind of how we function for that time, and kind of even till now. I think they're functioning in this church within a church model.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean Spencerville was a little bit different, kind of physically, because Spencerville owned the church, but the land belonged to the academy, as did the school building itself. And so there was this kind of like a shared space type situation. But for Spencerville, like the meeting space was always like a big deal. Because like the main church, the Korean side would use. And so when I was like really young, we would meet in one of the classrooms, and it was small enough where we could meet there and it was fine. But as it grew, when I got into like middle school, they needed a space, and I remember, I don't know how it started and who brought it up or what, but the Korean side agreed to hold their church services in the gym, and then the EM would have church in the sanctuary. And I think they did it for, like maybe not quite a year. The issue was, summers in Maryland, it's really hot and humid. The gym doesn't really have that great AC, and so you have these like older elderly people like sweating away in the gym, and so it kind of became almost like a health thing. And so for like the big bulk of my time at Spencerville, we would have services after lunch. So the EM would worship at like 1:30. And so for us, it was like a full day thing, because the children's ministry would still start at 9:30, and I was always involved in some level of children's ministry. So I'm there from 9 till like 4.
Wait, hold on. So you would have Sabbath school starting at 9:30, and your Sabbath school would go until 12 o'clock?
No. So for the children's, what we would do is we actually redid our children's ministry, and so essentially it was just like a mini VBS every weekend. So there were like stations, and so that rotation was from, I think it was from 10 to 12, but teachers get there early to set up.
I see.
I don't think there was a Sabbath school for like the English side. Or if there was, it might have been like 11 to 12 before potluck. But yeah, that was kind of our thing too. And same with LA Central. I remember like the big news was when the EM had their own bank account, and they were able to raise money and be completely financially autonomous from the Korean side, and that was considered like a huge thing. I guess rightfully so, because I think one thing that I've learned during my time as a pastor is money is power, right? That's true for any organization. Like money is the true power, the true authority. And so from there, the nature of English ministry has changed, I think, specifically with the way that churches are set up and organized. There have been a handful of churches where, as the EM grew, the KM wanted to shift the power and the ownership from the KM to the EM. So do you have any experiences, or like, do you know of any kind of stories or instances where that happened, Chris?
Yeah. We know that a number of years ago that happened in Chicago. I'm sure, Jason, you can speak to that because you were student pastor there during seminary. At one point, the Atlanta Korean made a shift like that, and they're still kind of working through that. At my own church here in Portland, we've had some conversations about that. Last year, we found out the San Diego church, which was like a Korean church that eventually merged with an American church. They were going through some of those processes as well. But Jason, I know Chicago, it happened, and it didn't really happen. Like they kind of reverted, which, was very unfortunate, at least from my perspective. What was that like?
Yeah, so I got to Chicago in 2010, and so I think 2 pastors before me, that's when they made that shift. The EM was pretty large at the time, and they decided to give the authority to the EM. So what that means is, according to the conference, the Illinois conference in this case, the English side was a recognized entity, and more importantly, the English board was the official board. So any minutes, any decisions, anything like that, it would have to go through the EM board for it to be recognized by the conference. By the time I got there, though, the EM was very small. It was really made up of like one large family, so like 3 siblings and their kids. and then like a handful of other families. So it was a youth position when I was first hired. It grew into an English ministry, not because I did anything, but for some weird reason, we got a bunch of people doing their residency and fellowship in Chicago from Loma Linda. And so I mean, at one point we had like 9, 10 families, which was pretty cool. But, functionally, it was the same as any other Korean church. The Korean side ran everything. They brought in most of the money. They made the decisions. It was just weirdly on paper, the EM had the authority. And so there would be times where like the pastor would come to me and say, okay, you need to quote vote on this matter because we need to send it to the conference, but it has to be passed by the EM board. So I take it to our board and be like, all right, everyone, we need to vote on, approval for evangelism fund, all in favor. And we just, we'd vote yes, and then we'd send it up to the conference. So, besides that kind of weird quirk, I mean, functionally it was the same as a Korean church running everything.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of what I've learned because, to be honest, we haven't really seen it yet. Would you say that's true?
We haven't. I mean, the only church that kind of still, I think, operates that way is San Diego, but that's also because they did merge with another non-Korean church, and so it's slightly different. I mean, Atlanta, I know, is still doing it, and they're kind of still going through the process of it and kind of work
next
out some of the
in a couple weeks we have our annual pastors meeting, and the pastor who is at that church will be there. I think it might be cool to talk with him and kind of hear what's going on there. Like I'm very much interested in that topic and seeing that kind of transition happen. And I think like as I've been thinking about it, I think it was cool that these certain Korean churches were like really radical in their thinking in terms of trying to hand over. But what I realize is a lot of times the English ministry, they weren't ready for it in a lot of ways. But then also the Korean ministry wasn't that ready either. So it was just like the timing was not right in terms of like the English ministry couldn't fully take on the leadership because of maybe like manpower, finances. But also the Korean ministry, like they wanted to, but they just like kind of held on a little bit more and weren't, so like it just, we haven't had that yet. And so I don't know, for me, I'm still really looking forward to having an example that's really awesome and kind of an inspiration to everybody.
Yeah, and I think, one of the issues was, and again, I don't know the background to any of these churches and what led to the decision, but from my limited perspective, it kind of seemed like there was no build up to this. It's kind of like if you have an 18-year-old kid and you want them to learn how to handle finances. You don't just say, all right, you're 18, you handle our family finances. It's terrible. You're gonna lose all your money. You teach them. There's a process, and I don't think any church has ever done that where they're like, okay, EM, our goal is in 5 years you run everything, so let me show you how to do it, and let's take you to the process. I don't think any church has done that.
That's true. I think at the closest thing is the church says, we will watch you and you need to prove to us that you can. Then we'll do it, maybe. I think that's that's kind of what we've seen. Yes. And not working. No,
I mean, unsurprisingly, right? Like, yeah. And then so the other model that's kind of popped up, and I don't know, maybe this is kind of like a taboo topic to bring up, but there were also churches that left the Korean church, the Korean speaking quote unquote mother church. There's a Upper Room Fellowship did that. Yorba Linda did that. Lombard did that. Wasn't there one in the Northern California region?
Silicon Valley, formerly Mountain View, separated. And they actually, they moved the building. They went completely separate.
So there's some of that. So what have you kind of heard or from your perspective? Like, what is your thoughts on that model?
Um, right now, maybe about 50-50 are doing okay, I would say. Oh, I'm not even sure if 50-50 is the actual number. But I know that a lot of these churches who have attempted that, like there were times where it was going well, and then for I'm sure many reasons, I think there are struggles there right now. I get the reasoning, I get the reasoning why people want to do this. Um, I I think I've come around because I was kind of like that. I used to talk to Jason about how I used to go to board meetings and feel so like oppressed that I would listen to Muse after the board meetings. And what's that song called, Jason, that I used to listen to?
I think it's called Uprising.
Uprising. Yeah. So you can tell just hearing that title what that song is. And it's kind of the song of like, I will not be like stepped on anymore. Like I'm gonna rise up. And so I used to blast this after some board meetings, Korean board meetings. And so I was very much like, yeah, let's leave. Let's go. Let's get out and let's do our own thing. I think I've softened, honestly, over the years. And
In
I
your
think, I
old
mean, I'm in a
age.
good situation. And you say because of age?
Yeah, it's softened in your old age.
Maybe. I think it has to do with I had a great Korean senior pastor fairly recently, and so it kind of changed my opinions. And talking to members, I think there is definitely a sense of, in the same way that for your parents, you want to take care of your parents when they get older. I think there are a lot of members in our churches that actually feel that same way. That to walk away for them, and I'm not saying it is, but feels like abandoning them. And I think there are a lot of members in our churches who are not ready to do that. And I think for me, like I definitely understand that point. And now not everyone thinks that way. I know Jason doesn't. So I'm curious to hear what you think, man.
Yeah, I mean, we'll have. I mean, this topic is its own podcast episode, which we'll absolutely get to. But kind of just previewing it. Yeah, I mean, I don't think this is a model for every church, in the sense that I don't think every EM should aspire to leave the Korean side. That's not at all what I'm saying. But I think we need to recognize it as a viable choice. And I think one of the big issues is, to my understanding, every church that went through this, it was a very messy separation.
Yeah.
Right? It was, yeah, it was. I remember I got to Chicago right after kind of Lombard was formed, and it's kind of like walking in, blissfully unaware of what had happened. And I remember one time I suggested, like, hey, let's do a joint ski trip with Lombard, and the looks I got from the leadership, I was like, oh, I clearly have touched on a sensitive topic. I'm sorry. But, and I think because, again, it kind of points to the unplanned nature of it. I think if we viewed it more like a church plant, I think it could go more smoothly. And I think that, before I was more like, leave. And I think I too, in my middle age, have kind of, I don't want to say softened, but I think I've folded in different perspective. And it actually happened while I was in LA Central. The neighborhood that LA Central is in is called Boyle Heights, East LA. It's a largely Hispanic neighborhood. The Korean side, their major area of target is Koreatown, and which is, I don't know how far Koreatown is from East LA, but it's not close. And I remember thinking, like, man, it would make a lot of sense if we planted in Boyle Heights. The staff would still be the same. We'd still be one church. Just physically, we'd be at different locations. That would just kind of enhance the ministry a little bit more. And I'm kind of more leaning in that direction, where it's not like the young people are leaving and it's a messy split and there's like hurt, broken families everywhere. It's just more like, hey, we're planting. We're still one church, one entity, but it's just two different locations, because the reality is EMKM, we have different targets, different ministry objectives, different visions, different missions, and maybe we acknowledge it, and kind of embrace it and view it kind of like a church planting type situation. I mean, but for me, like, the last church I worked at was Yorba Linda, and so that does kind of skew my perspective. It's been 14 years and they're still growing, and I don't know, it was really nice to. They still have a Korean ministry. It's about 40 people. So it's Yorba Linda technically is not on the same level of like a Lombard upper room because there's a Korean ministry, but it was awesome to see Korean group kind of just be totally like give everything up for the EM. I remember when I got there, I wanted to revamp the media and like the worship, because that was kind of my job. And what would happen is the KM would have worship in the sanctuary from like 9:30 to 10:30, and then the EM would start at 11. So there's 30 minutes to do praise. It's supposed to be sound check. What's praise practice, setting up all the live stream, setting up all this stuff. It's like 30 minutes. I was like, it's not feasible. And so I asked, like, is it possible for the KM to like worship in a different room? And they started worshiping in our warehouse, and there was no complaints. They just did it, and that was really cool to see. We figured something else that works a lot better now, but so I definitely understand the idea of like they sacrifice much for us, and there is a element of kind of taking care of them, kind of in that. But on the flip side, there's also a lot of issues with sometimes staying with the Korean side, especially with like, again, like I said, money and just those tensions. So I mean, that's a topic that we're going to spend obviously a lot more time.
I think to kind of circle back to the beginning of our conversation, the reason why I think what you're saying is challenging is because I think that like tribalism, that like identity is still there. And to do such a thing, it feels like a split, even though it's strategic. And so I think that in the minds of many Korean ministries, to allow a group to leave is like you have given up, or you lost half of your people. And I think the difference is you don't see it that way. You see it as a strategic move to reach. I think some people, the way Korean churches are, I think they would see that as you lost all these people, which I think makes it really challenging for churches to approach it in that way. I'm not saying that's an excuse,
sure,
but like thinking about how the history of our church and how they were then, like that's still a thing now.
I think so, and I can understand that perspective, even though I may not 100% agree. I do understand that perspective. And so, in closing, very briefly, like, what do you think is what will EM ministry look like in the future?
I think I have kind of a grim outlook, or it's like half. I think some EM ministries are going to fall apart, and I think there are ones that are doing well, and they're going to keep doing well. Like, it's kind of, I don't know if like we're in that, I don't know how that works like in our world right now, but kind of like the loss of the middle spot,
the middle class.
Yeah, it's like we're just going to be left with like, I guess a middle class church. I don't know. Like there's going to be churches in random spots that have to exist, and they're just like always going to just like survive. And then those middle ones, I think those people are going to eventually just join, a stronger church. I think there are going to be, I really don't know as far as like more churches going to leave and become these, what you call third space churches. Like, are we gonna have more of those? I don't know. I don't really know about that. But I do feel like we're going to lose that middle group of churches eventually.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's definitely a possibility. We are in that weird place where there's like churches that are thriving and then churches that are like struggling deeply. I don't think there's any church that's like, we're okay. Like, we're fine. Like, you're kind of one or the other. I feel like if you're not sure where you are, you're probably on the struggling
Yeah.
side. But I mean, it's really, yeah, it's going to be fascinating because the Korean American Church was at its core and historically predicated on kind of retaining the cultural identity, right? I don't know. Did LA Central have Hangarakyo, Korean school?
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
Spencerville did too. It's it was like part of a lot of Korean churches to have a Korean school associated with to preserve the culture, and that was told pretty much every church I've been to. It's not explicitly said, but it's kind of between the lines. Like we want to retain the culture, we want to hold on to the culture, we want to pass it down to the next generation. I don't know if that really exists in the next generation. Like even like me and my wife, we're gonna put our son into dual language. It's not Korean. He's gonna be speaking Chinese. So how does that fit, right?
Yeah, I think that's the big question as far as the future is, what does it mean for the Korean church when half or more of the people there are not Korean anymore? What does that mean? And what elements of Koreanness do we maintain? And what do we get rid of?
Yeah, and this is kind of teasing our next episode, but there's also tension between kind of Korean culture and other Asian cultures, specifically Southeast Asia, that's kind of developed in the last couple of weeks, which is something we're going to talk about next week. I keep saying next episode. This kind of growing tension between South Korea and Southeast Asia, and how that kind of it doesn't seem like it impacts the Korean church, but yeah, I think it does. So that's something we'll be talking about next episode.
Yeah, guys, thanks so much. I feel like for me, one of my kind of takeaways from this conversation is to continue to hope for the best, for our churches, and to realize that the way forward is actually going to be different than it has been in the past. I think there's a sense of identity and pride that we need to take in our church, but that can't govern, the direction and the way we treat kind of the rest of our the people in our churches and other like ministries that form. But as we conclude, we want to invite you guys to continue joining us on this journey as we're trying to figure it out. So thanks for joining us for this episode of the Potluck. We hope you'll join us for our next episode. We're going to be talking about some more interesting things about faith and culture and the Korean American Adventist Church. We'd love for you guys to subscribe to our show, and we will see you next time.